But for today, we've got a great speaker lined up. Professor Bechtel is actually one of the nominees of students of the CSDC. We're really excited to have him here. And one of the things that me and my fellow nomineers, one of the reasons we did this is because Professor Bechtel's work really is interested in sort of causal explanations, but not in sort of a traditional way, and really trying to look out some of those hard to reach places where you can get some causal leverage and exploiting that to their best. And in particular, it's not just sort of these causal explanations. Generally, it's that the research questions that the professor is really interested in going after are ones that are classics of political science, political behavior, IPE. And so not just looking at causation for causation's sake, but really trying to say what can some of the unusual things that have happened in human history tell us about the political world. His work is published in Journal of Politics, British Journal of Political Science, International Organization, AJPS, and PNAS, which this talk today is based on an article that was published earlier on in the year, but of course the professor's continuing to kind of explore the same themes. So really looking forward to the talk. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the professor.
Thank you very much, Angus. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about inequality and redistribution behavior. This is joint work with one of my former PhD students, Roman Liesch, and one of my long-term authors, Ken Shivi. So if there's anything you like about this paper, then please feel free to attribute this to both of those. And if there's anything you don't like, then it's clearly my fault. In this paper, we're trying to do several things, but one important starting point for this project was the fact that for a very long time, economic inequality has been increasing in many countries on this planet. So, for example, in India, we can see this pretty strong increase as indicated by the share of the national income owned by that share of the population, by the top 10% of the population. And so irrespective of whether you look at like India or the United States and Canada, Russia, China, and also Europe, you can see this long-term trend in inequality that has been increasing for a long time. And that really poses a puzzle from a political science perspective, because many of those countries that have experienced a strong increase in inequality are democracies. And in democracies, the poor could vote for more redistribution, right? So if the bottom 90% are greedy, right, because they own half of the income, whereas the top 10% own the other half, then they could vote for redistributive policies. They could support politicians who offer the types of platforms that would effectively reduce inequality. So why is that the case? Why is it the case that inequality persists even in democracies where voters could vote for more redistribution? And there exist several potential explanations in literature, and I'm only briefly highlighting some of them. One of them being, well, maybe getting active politically and making your voices heard, telling your politicians, your elected officials that you really want inequality to be reduced and they should finally take effective measures to do this. That constitutes a collective action problem, right? The costs of becoming active are private. You incur those costs, whereas the benefits of realizing, say, a more equal distribution of wealth are social or collective, right? And so then that means voters may just face a prisoner's dilemma in which the national government would be to try to free ride on the political efforts of other citizens. And ultimately, collective action will be below what would be like socially optimal. So that's one explanation, the political collective action explanation. Another is, well, maybe citizens think that the distribution of wealth may be unequal, and there may be good reasons for why it is unequal. Maybe it really reflects this the origin of the inequality and beliefs about whether the origins are acceptable and the consequences desirable. Specifically, if you have a poor work ethic, like this dog, right? Then maybe this dog is poor, and there's a reason for why that's the case, because, well, he's obviously not working hard on getting those papers published. Whereas if you are very ambitious and you put in a lot of work and effort, then you can live what some would call the American dream, and you would become rich because you've been working so hard. So this is this idea of maybe there are differences in beliefs about the origin of inequality, and that has something to do with luck versus effort. And if you think it's really an effort-based result, then you may be fine with like high levels of inequality. Another explanation that has been highlighted recently has something to do with perceptions of wealth, and specifically perceptions of inequality. So like this cat looking in the mirror and thinking, I'm really a very strong, well-fed lion, but in reality, I'm actually pretty small, and I'm not very powerful, and I'm not very rich. That's supposed to illustrate one of the findings in the literature, which is that generally individuals misperceive their position in the income distribution, and generally they overestimate how wealthy they are compared to the overall distribution of wealth. So you might think I'm actually pretty good off, right? I'm pretty rich, but then if you would compare your own estimate of where you are in the on the income distribution, you would find that you're actually probably not that rich, right? Most people are compared to most others, you're not that rich. Final explanation or a complementary explanation that we are trying to explore in more detail is it could also have something to do with the extent to which individuals are averse or not averse to inequality. If you generally don't care a lot about economic inequality, right, then why should you support measures to reduce it? No reason to do so. And even if you do not generally care about why inequality persists, the fact that you're a political scientist, a social scientist, I think that should make you interested in this research question, because many arguments in many different literatures that we apply in order to theorize about why, for example, some individuals, some voters prefer specific candidates over others, or they prefer specific policies, that has something to do with the different costs and benefits that those options entail. So whenever those political options entail different costs and benefits, then choosing them has redistributive effects. Some will be exposed to higher costs than others, right, as a function of those political choices. So those choices result in a specific reallocation of wealth, just broadly construed. And voter preferences over policies and also candidates are typically assumed to depend, well, on those costs and benefits, but also on their implicit beliefs about what actually is a desirable distribution of wealth. And those inequality-related arguments are really used in many different fields, although sometimes they're not very explicit, but they have been used in research on economic policy preferences, on why some individuals are more in favor of protecting the environment than others, on foreign policy, specifically foreign economic policy, global climate cooperation, why are some more in favor of global climate cooperation, especially if that would entail costs and redistribution across countries, for example. Well, that may depend on how averse or not averse you are to inequality and changing inequality. And various other literatures, regime stability, electoral behavior, and so on. So this is, I think, a good reason to try to think more rigorously about what does it mean to be averse to inequality, and what different interesting theoretical scenarios can we distinguish. One of the problems that I think this literature, including my own work, has to deal with is if you want to implement more rigorous tests of those arguments, you would actually need individual level information about the level of inequality aversion for each individual. Also, what you would ideally need, well, you would want to know the causal effect of inequality on redistribution. How does exposure, actual exposure to inequality, affects redistribution? And here we're talking really about behavior, but we think that also tells us something about the policy views that individuals hold. So the second point was, I already mentioned, we need individual level estimates of aversion to actually two different types of inequality. One that maybe some of us would enjoy more, which is advantageous inequality, that's you are richer than the other, and disadvantageous inequality, that's if the other is richer than you. And those two different scenarios may have different implications as to what type of redistribution you actually support. In this paper, we are trying to do several things, but the most important contributions that I would like to highlight is we provide causal estimates of the effect of advantageous and disadvantageous inequality on actual redistribution behavior in representative samples for the United States and Germany. We developed a method that subsequent research can use to determine and classify individual redistribution types. And we also demonstrate that those redistribution types that are based on behavioral responses correlate with support for redistributive policy in, I think, theoretically meaningful ways. We measure inequality aversion using a give or take game, and we combine this game with a randomized inequality experiment. So whenever you want to identify a cause and effect, the cleanest way of doing this is a randomized experiment. In this case, the treatment that we are interested in is different types of inequality. So we want to expose individuals to different types of inequality, distinguishing between advantageous, disadvantageous inequality, and probably equality, where there's an equal distribution of wealth. So we need to vary, we want to vary the initial distribution of wealth, and we do this in the context of a give or take game where individuals can either give to somebody else or take from somebody else. And so here's a little bit more information about the give or take game. So we implemented this, we wanted to implement this in a large-scale survey, 2 large-scale surveys. And we told respondents that we will raffle 2 gift cards among all individuals who completed the survey. And we randomly assigned inequality between those 2 subjects by varying the initial distribution of the value of those gift cards. And there were 3 different conditions. One is your gift card could be worth $75, and the gift card of the other person was worth $25. That would be an advantageous inequality condition. We also had a condition that actually gave both respondents $50. So that's an equality condition. And we had the third condition, which is a disadvantageous inequality scenario where you would have $25 and the other person initially would have a gift card that's worth $75. So we field this, we include this experiment in representative survey, in a survey that we fielded to representative samples in the United States and Germany, and we asked respondents, how much do you want to give to or take from the other? So they exposed to different types of inequality, and then we asked them, do you want to change that, right? And if so, how? And since inequality is randomly assigned, the responses, so the redistribution behavior that we observe, is causally attributable to the differences in the initial distribution of wealth. So those are some of the results. First of all, well, what is it that you would expect? Specifically, if you are a hyper egoistic, self-interested voter, then just to be clear about the theoretical benchmark, I think the theoretical benchmark would be you should always take everything, right? Irrespective of the distribution of wealth. If you don't care about the if it's all about maximizing your own wealth, it doesn't matter how the initial distribution of wealth looks like, you want everything. If the other's richer, you take 75. If the other's poorer, you take 25. If you're equally wealthy, you take 50. That's not what we're observing. Instead, we observe that in response to advantageous inequality, so this is the type of inequality where you are richer than the other, and actually you are $50 richer, you would, on average, give about $10 or euros. If you are assigned to an equality condition, if you're assigned to the disadvantageous inequality condition, so this is where you have less than the other, then you would take from the other, and you would take on average about $10 as well. If you're exposed to perfect equality, then redistribution behavior is actually not distinguishable from zero. So on average, individuals leave the distribution unchanged. All right, so yes, there is significant redistribution behavior in response to inequality, and the direction of those effects is consistent with, I think, some level of like a degree of aversion to inequality. At the same time, it's obvious that even if respondents have the chance to perfectly equalize outcomes, they refrain from doing so. You could perfectly equalize outcomes by, for example, taking 25 from the person that's richer, right? And then you will end up with perfect equality. But that's not what's happening. So individuals generally imperfectly equalize wealth. I said we ideally want, yes?
So are there any difference between the US sample and the German sample?
Yeah, there are some small differences, not
Terribly
strikingly different, but there's some differences in the directions that I think you would expect. But I have the by country results and happy to show them in the Q&A. I said we also need individual level measures of inequality aversion. And we elicit inequality aversion by asking respondents to produce what we call a conditional redistribution schedule. And the way this works is we keep an individual's, a respondent's own initial endowment constant. So if you have been initially assigned to the, say, $25 condition, you were poorer than the other, then we leave this unchanged. And we change the value of the other person's gift card. Specifically, the other person's gift card can take on all the values listed here. So it could be 5, it is 15. We ask them, like, how much will you distribute if the other has 25, 50, 75, 85, 95, and so on. And we do this for every individual. This is just one example, respondent 19. And respondent 19 exhibits behavior that is consistent with, well, it is consistent with inequality aversion, right? Because if the other is richer, this is this area, then respondent 19 tends to take from the other. And respondent 19 actually takes almost perfectly half of the difference, which means he or she is equalizing. That's actually one of the rare instances where our parameter estimates have a clear theoretical interpretation, because the 22.5 degree line here means equalizing behavior. If the inequality difference is negative, that means the other is actually poorer, then respondent 19 on average gives half of the difference to the other. Again, equalizing the inequality between them. Of course, there's a lot of interesting heterogeneity. So this is respondent 1546. So respondent 1546 is somewhat asymmetric, because if she or he is actually, if he or she is poorer, so the other is richer, then this person would equalize. But if she or he is richer, then she would leave the initial distribution unchanged. So fine with being richer. Also, I mean, it could be worse, right? It could take everything. Right? But certainly it's not the case that this person would be sensitive to this type of inequality. So we have 5,000 of those individual redistribution schedules for each individual. One table that tells us, well, how much will you redistribute in response to different levels and directions of inequality. And we code those 5,000 individual redistribution schedules. We distinguish between theoretically, I think, interesting values. Those are, so what I'm showing here are just the regression coefficients estimated on those individual contribution schedules. And we distinguish two scenarios, one in which you are richer and one in which you're poorer. And we estimate separate elasticities for each of those two scenarios. And that provides us with an individual level estimate of, well, aversion to two different types of inequality. One being advantageous inequality aversion, where you are averse to being richer than somebody else, and the other being disadvantageous inequality aversion, which is, well, you are poorer than somebody else. And so this plots the distribution of those estimated inequality aversion parameters. And there are two, again, like theoretically informative and meaningful values. One is 0, and you can see this is a modal value for both of those distributions. And that just means those individuals, on average, do not respond to inequality. They leave the distribution of wealth unchanged. A level of 0.5 is consistent with perfect equalization. So on average, those individuals that have an elasticity of 0.5, they redistribute exactly the half of the difference, which leaves both of them equally wealthy or equally poor. We also use this information to classify individuals into broader types. And there's an interesting story, I think, to be told about how this helps to explain the absence of large-scale policy interventions that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the conclusion. So this just plots the distribution, the joint distribution of D redistribution types. So those are the types that redistribute in response to disadvantageous inequality, and A redistribution types. Those are this is the information about how you respond to advantageous inequality. And we distinguish between three groups, one being those who tend to equalize, just broadly, those who do not tend to equalize, and then there's another category, a residual category, that takes care of those who do not really exhibit a clear pattern. And one of the interesting findings is that there's only 30% of the population that is willing to redistribute in response to both types of inequality. So those are the ones that would equalize irrespective of whether they are exposed to disadvantageous or advantageous inequality. All right, so one criticism, I think, that is important and interesting to address is whether a redistribution type, as measured in our abstract, hypothetical, give or take game, is that really relevant for understanding policy preferences? And in order to address this question, we want to distinguish between a policy that makes the poor richer and a policy that makes the rich poorer. Those are two ways in which we can reduce wealth differences. And one standard policy instrument to make the poor richer is to tax them more heavily. So we ask respondents to indicate on generally the extent to which they agree or disagree with the idea that the government should redistribute wealth or impose heavy taxation on the wealth on the wealthy. Right. The second question that we ask is related to this idea of making the poor richer, which is, well, welfare policy. And we specifically asked respondents whether to what extent they agree or disagree with the idea of the government spending less on benefits for the poor. And then we recode this for the analysis. And there's some theoretical expectations that we can spell out. Specifically, we would expect that those who are averse to disadvantageous inequality should be more likely to support taxing the rich, but they should not be more likely to support helping the poor. If you're only averse to disadvantageous inequality, why should you want to redistribute to the, you don't want to necessarily, you don't care about whether you can make the poor richer. You're concerned about making the rich poorer. The second expectation is, well, aversion to advantageous inequality, however, should predict support for helping the poor. This is this altruistic component, but it should not predict support for taxing the rich. And if we look at the results, just correlate those different redistribution types and policy views, this is the pattern that we find. The red dots are the point estimates for the pooled data, and we find that de-equalizers, so those are the individuals that tend to equalize in response to disadvantageous or unfavorable inequality, are significantly more likely to support heavy taxes on the rich. However, de-equalizer does not predict support for not spending less on the poor. If we look at the advantageous equalizers, then we find the exact opposite. Aversion to advantageous inequality is not predictive of, supporting taxes for the heavy taxes on the rich. It does, however, predict your policy views with respect to welfare spending and welfare retention. So this is consistent with the idea that there are really two different types of inequality, and the responses to those different types of inequality differ across individuals, but also even with an individual may be willing to redistribute in response to disadvantageous inequality, but maybe not in response to disadvantageous inequality. So why does inequality persist? Trying to answer this initial question. Well, one reason is because individuals equalize imperfectly. Although we find that inequality does cause redistributive behavior, and the types of, the directions are consistent with ideas such as altruism and envy, individuals equalize imperfectly even if they fully control redistribution. In our give or take game, they have full control over redistribution. There are also no costs to redistribution. We're not subtracting anything from their gift card because they have decided to redistribute, right? There's no loss. However, the policy interventions that reduce inequality in the real world are, of course, associated with various types of uncertainty, and they are also not costless. So that tells you something about how plausible it is to expect support for the types of policy interventions that would be really effective at, strongly reducing the inequality that we observe nowadays. And that, I think, is one potential explanation for why the willingness to back many policies that would be most effective at reducing inequality will be even lower. Now, there's a second, I think, finding that we can highlight as an explanation, which is based on this result that apparently voters are really divided over how to respond to different types of inequality. Well, in what sense are they divided? Those who are willing to back redistribution in response to favorable inequality are not the ones, not generally the ones who would also back interventions that would reduce the other type of inequality. So there's really this tension and this divide between individuals and the willingness to back the types of policy interventions that will really be most effective at reducing inequality. All right, so some of the things that we are still working on have to do with, well, how can this be applied in future work? In what areas could this be helpful? As I said, I think there is this general trend to try to explain policy preferences, support for parties, candidates, and so on, by emphasizing the redistributive consequences that those options have. And that means that the level of aversion to different types of inequality may actually help explain some of the variation in support for those different options. And future research could use the give or take or inequality aversion module to actually implement more direct tests of those theoretical arguments. And so as part of those ongoing efforts, we're actually making not only the questionnaire, but also the Qualtrics module that we programmed for the study. We are planning to make this available for download. And so if you are interested in using this in your own surveys, then you can just go to this page and download those modules. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions. Yes.
Yeah, just a few questions on the design of the experiment. So essentially, you made people do the experiment and then ask them to answer survey, right?
Can you say the last part again, please?
Yeah. The design of the experiment was this: you made people redistribute their thing, the gift card, and then you made them answer to some survey questions regarding policies. Am I right?
Yes, in the main study, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Don't you think there's a concern that by making people go through an experiment first, you affect the considerations they have when they answer the survey? And is there a way to account for that? Or
so I'm tempted. To, yeah. I totally I can share that general. I'm sure. At the same time, I'd be curious to learn how this is supposed to play out. Like what type of effect should this have on what kind of quantity of interest that we're estimating here? So I mean that's one question that I would ask you back. But we also actually did a validation study in which we randomly reversed the order of the give or take module and the policy views model. So it's like 50% of our respondents would first see the policy views question, then they would do the give or take game, and the other 50% would get the reverse order. And the results remain very similar. Yes?
Thank you for this very interesting experiment and report. I'm interested, so in your experiment, you put the people into a personal situation of inequality, or in what way, they get a certain amount, and that determines how they react to redistribution. But when you move to the policy part, how do you account for an individual's own situation? Because I think that's a major issue in terms of how you react to redistributive policies in your own situation, how you view yourself and the society. You talked earlier about perceptions, but there's also the real income of the person that might affect. So how can you account for that in your comparison of reacting to the experiment and to the policy? Have you done this, for example, separately for people who are poorer vis-a-vis the majority versus people who are richer or who are more in the median and so on? And is then the result the same across these three groups, for example?
Yeah, so there are two responses to this, I think. One is, well, if you're interested in just the causal effects, of inequality, then because of the randomized experiment, because of random assignment, there's no need to control for income, right? Because the randomization ensures that those different treatment groups are perfectly, in expectations, comparable with respect to all observable and unobservable characteristics. The way we could rephrase this is, all right, so to what extent is the response to inequality, to what extent does it depend on your own income? like the actual like reported individual income. And that's one of the things that we are exploring. So far, it seems that there's very little heterogeneity across income groups. So it's not the case that so if you're like relatively rich, then you're like way more sensitive to differences in wealth than when you're poor. So I don't think that there's really a strong like moderation going on. So this is the first half of the study, and then the second half, which no longer is causally identified. So when we talk about the policy views, then we're no longer in the world of a randomized experiment. So certainly equalizer type is not randomly assigned. And that's where we are back in the world of like controlling, of course. And so those correlations, they actually come from a regression model in which we add a full set of socio-demographic controls, such as male income, like income groups, age, and so on, and ideology. So those are partial correlations. They control for those other covariates, including income.
So are you saying that whether you are poor or rich, it doesn't change your reaction to the experiment?
It doesn't really, like, I'm saying it doesn't strongly change your response. Yeah. So we find, so put it differently, we find the general like type of response to different types of inequality, irrespective of whether you are low income or high income or medium income. Like, there's not a like, super like a strong interaction between those two features.
And even if you look at the perception?
What do you mean by perceptions?
Well, how you perceive yourself. There is a difference between, as you said yourself, like between the actual income and the perception.
Yeah. So the income information is based on self-reported income. So I can't. We cannot really like we didn't ask them to indicate, say, on this scale.
Yeah.
How rich or poor are you compared to others?
Okay.
We did not ask them to position themselves in their income distribution, and we did not compare this to the actual distribution of wealth. So we don't have that measure. That's we didn't measure these perceptions, and I think the way to think about this is that in our experiment, there is no misperception as to what the initial distribution of wealth is. That's perfectly known, and we communicate this. And so that type of uncertainty or misperception, I don't think that can explain the response to inequality.
No, that's for sure. No, I was looking into heterogeneous effects.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my answer to this. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, those are three. So maybe the gentleman in the back first. Yeah.
I have a question about the way you generate the inequality. So basically, you do that in a kind of exogenous way. So it's not the responsibility of people. Basically, those who are richer get a bigger count. It's just by chance. If you talk about aiding basically people play first a game where they feel like they got more because they deserve more. Because in reality, a lot of inequality, or I don't know, a lot, but some of inequality do contribute to the ability of your folk of the behavior.
Yeah, so this is, we thought about doing this, and I think it taps into this other potentially really important explanation for why individuals tolerate inequality, and that has something to do with knowing where it comes from. And so we thought about implementing this kind of an additional experiment, basically crossing this, where you would first do 50% would be asked to do a very tedious task, like a very painful, count the number of words in this paragraph, and we would offer something in return if they correctly, count those numbers, then they would get rewarded, right? And so they would earn they would earn part of the endowment. And so the question would be then, well, if you make this information available to the other, and also this person knows that she has worked for this, whether that changes your willingness to redistribute. I think that's the question. And so I think that's super interesting, and I'd love to do something in the future. We haven't done this at this point because I think it is a complementary explanation that I think deserves its own study. And so our interest was really in trying to understand what is the cause and effect of there is inequality, you can do something about it. You don't know anything basically about where it comes from. So that's one way of like getting a clean estimate of how do individuals respond to inequality in initial endowments. But I totally agree with you that this would be an interesting follow-up. Yeah, we had Crystal.
Thanks, Michael. So I actually had a really similar question, so let me ask another aspect of it. And this might sound a little just semantic, but you talk about different types of inequality, and this advantageous, disadvantageous, to me, it's the same inequality. It's just what matters is where you are alongside it. But the Gini coefficient would be the same, right? So then this is not reduced to showing that people who have money don't like to give it away, and people who don't have money like to get some more. And so can you say something about this? Are you actually catching different types of inequality that we might think of as describing different societies? And then I guess I have a kind of a general question about taking out a sample. Can you speculate? I'm sure you've thought a lot about this. To what extent is this catching, this game is catching, the interesting things that we think of when we think about inequality? So here you're giving $25 gift cards. But inequality is a lot about status. It's a lot about I worry about my children and so on. So do you have a sense, if you were to guess, for instance, if you were to increase those gift cards to $25,000, how would things differ, do you think?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So maybe take those in reverse order. So all right, so one way to think about the second part of your comment is it has something to do with the stakes. So those are relatively small amounts. It is a potential benefit it's in expectations, right? It's up to what extent that you're willing to generalize from this, but certainly like the idea of stakes being an important issue here when we think about to what extent this generalizes. We did a follow-up study where we varied the stakes, and we did spend quite some money on this. So you can ignore columns 2 and 3. And this is just the results from a follow-up study we did on MTurk. And the purpose was really to get at the effect of stakes. What happened, like does the redistribution behavior change if the stakes are higher? And so the initial results, this is model 1, just based on an MTurk sample. So those are just 500 individuals, right? But they played exactly the same game, give or take, randomized inequality. There are 3 different conditions. One is disadvantageous inequality, the other is equality, and the third is advantageous inequality. And we observe the same kind of tendencies. If you are exposed to disadvantageous inequality, so you are poorer than you take from the other. This was the initial distribution of the initial endowments, so 25 versus 75. If there was equality, well, you would take a little bit. If there was advantageous inequality where you are richer than the other, you would give something, like a small but significant amount. And now the question is, what happens if you raise the stakes considerably? And you can raise the stakes in 2 ways. One is you make the nominal amount of the gift cards higher, like dramatically higher maybe. And the other is you reduce the number of respondents that are taking part in the prize drawing, right? Then your probability of winning one of those is higher. So we did both of those things simultaneously, and this is model 4. So we just replicated or mimicked the same design, but we multiplied the value of the gift cards by 4. So we were talking about, say, the $25, where suddenly they were worth 100, right? And $50 were worth 200, and so on. And also, we decided to only administer this to about 50%, not 50 respondents, because everybody would actually get one of those gift cards. That was the payoff mechanism. So at this point, it was no longer a price drawing. You would actually get the 25. That was what you're getting, and you can decide to give or take. Right? So it was a certain, in some sense, a certain or like highly certain gain. Now, what do we find? We find the same patterns. So on average, individuals are redistributing in response to disadvantage and inequality, and they would take from the other. If they are richer in the give or take game, then they would give significantly. And if they were equally wealthy, then they would basically leave the distribution unchanged. So, excuse me, those are the model 3 are the results. So they would, for example, in response to disadvantage inequality, they would take $100, like $100 or euros. That's what they would do. Now this looks like much more than in the standard gift card payoff mechanism, which is what we used in the main study. But if you divide this by 4, then suddenly it's not, that's not that different. Like 18, 26, 7, and 6. So roughly this is this, roughly same ballpark. And so I think this is suggestive in that the stakes are not like a crucial element that would fundamentally change our results. If we were to raise the stakes, like, it's not the case that we suddenly see a lot more, say, egoistic behavior or a lot more selfish behavior. That's not what's going on. So this, I think, is somewhat informative about the extent to which you want to believe those results if you think about raising or changing the stakes. The second question, your first question was about the those different types of inequality. And so my take on this would be, well, it's true. We live, say, in a country that at any point in time has a fixed income distribution. At the same time, I can be richer than the median or poorer, which, by the way, if you apply the Meltzer-Richards model, that will be your key reference, right? So, like, are you richer than the mean or the median, right? So that would be a key benchmark that you would use to form beliefs about, well, are you in favor of redistribution or against? So if you're richer than 50%, then you would be against. If you're poorer, then you would be in favor, for example. And so those two extreme cases where you are richer than a benchmark or poorer, I think those are being captured exactly in the give or take game and this inequality experiment, where, well, 2 of the 3 conditions are extreme inequality or clear inequality where you are poorer, and the second would be where you're richer, and one of them being a scenario in which you're equal. So I do think they capture like meaningful, theoretically interesting combinations of different types of inequality that should be relevant for how willing you are to redistribute in response to those different types of inequality. Yeah, I think you were first.
So you answered the first question I had, which was about you have this idea of perceptions, risk perceptions might figure in there, but I think you solved it by having a guaranteed payout, and that seems robust. My other question was, so you pitched this as like, all right, we explain like these, there's increasing inequality, and like this is why people don't react to it. But it's like, well, the U.S. Had a time where there was, extraordinary efforts at redistribution, but you have a 90% marginal tax rate. How did that happen? And you have look across places, right? Germany does a lot more redistribution than U.S. and Sweden even more. So if you have these kind of presumably innate preferences for distribution, how can this tell us anything about policy? Really? If you have this enormous variation, assuming that this is not like endogenous somehow.
Okay, so I think there are several very interesting aspects. One is this question about whether those are primitives. Is this inherited? Is this stable? Can this be manipulated? And I don't think we make the claim that this is totally, so we do not make the claim that your willingness to support redistribution is perfectly determined by your some kind of innate aversion or like a socialized, in your childhood, you've learned something about what's a desirable level of inequality, and that would, like, for the rest of your life, fully determine your policy views. We do not make that claim. All we say is that that at least some of the variation in A, redistribution behavior, and B, views about what the government should do or not do in order to reduce inequality, part of that variation can be explained by your aversion to inequality. And of course, there's like a lot of room for those complementary explanations that have to do with, say, Luckw's effort, beliefs about where the origin of inequality, the role of partisan ties, ideological convictions, belief in the free market, and so on. So a long list of potentially other interesting and relevant explanations. Then there's like, there was this part in your question that tried to extrapolate historically, which is certainly that is challenging. So I'm thinking about, like, there is intergenerational change. So the fact that maybe 60 years ago, maybe the willingness to redistribute was different. That may, I'm totally willing to believe that that's the case. At the same time, given that inequality has increased dramatically over the past decades, I think that, like, all the more makes this an interesting question to ask. So at some point, maybe there was more redistribution, then had stopped, right? And so suddenly we live in a world where for decades inequality has increased, and we do not see the kind of major policy interventions that would be necessary to at least limit the rate at which inequality increases. And the third component that I see in this question has to do with the cross-country variation. And there is some, like, accepting that this is only, of course, a partial explanation, there is cross-country variation. If you're willing to entertain a very small 2n comparison across countries, and here we talk about the United States and Germany, that is consistent with the differences in the share of redistribution types in those two countries. So specifically, let me pull up those results. So here's the first part of that answer. The first part is, if we break down the joint distribution of redistribution type by country, where the first number is the share of individuals in Germany that redistribute in response to both favorable and unfavorable inequality, that's 40% roughly, whereas in the United States, it's 24. Right? So that is one piece that I think is sort of consistent with what we think, one piece of evidence is consistent with what we think is going on. Now, the second part is, what about actual redistribution? And if you look at some, I think, informative indicators, such as specifically the poverty rate. This is the poverty rate in the United States before taxes and transfers, about 30. After taxes and transfers, it's reduced to 24.24. So reduction is about like 0.8. Germany starts at roughly the same level, 0.36, then brings it down by 20 percentage points. Right? So there's a lot more redistribution in Germany, and that's consistent with the fact that the share of those individuals who are willing to back those types of policy efforts that are most effective is like considerably higher. And you find the same pattern if you look at income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, where again, before taxes and transfers, the United States and Germany are very similar, 0.5. But after taxes and redistribution, the United States is at 0.4, whereas Germany is at 0.3. So those patterns, I think, also consistent with the cross-country variation in our survey results. Angus.
Thanks for an interesting talk and an interesting study. You really focused on these A-type and B-type people, but I'm curious about sort of the other side of it. So the equalizers and sort of the non-equalizers. These people who under both conditions are engaging in the same sort of behavior. And the reason I'm asking is that you show us this kind of nice plot based on attitudes towards redistribution afterwards. So there's very clean results there. But I'm wondering for the equalizers and for the non-equalizers, if you see the expected effects. So that would be non-equalizers, everything should be close to the line around 0. And for the equalizers, ostensibly they would favor both increased taxation and increased spending on poverty reduction measures. So I'm wondering if you've looked at that analysis, because of course the plurality of the respondents are the equalizers. Maybe not in the United States case, I wasn't sure, but in the Germany case for sure, and across the whole sample. But then also you have 17% on these non-equalizer categories. These are actually bigger in some ways than your A and B, or A and B, which you focus in on. So I'm wondering if you rerun the analysis looking at those two groups and whether or not they meet your theoretical expectations as well.
So I think this is what we are doing here, because what this does is it simply tells you whether moving from a non-equalizer, like a non-D, D just stands for disadvantageous, so somebody who would equalize or would be exposed to disadvantageous inequality, and then coding whether that person tends to equalize or not equalize. And so this tells you how does moving from somebody who does not tend to equalize to somebody who does equalize, does that change the probability of this person supporting the idea that the government should redistribute wealth by heavy taxes on the rich. So that is, I think, the contrast that you have in mind. And but I like you pointing out that there are really two types of inequality, which is like disadvantageous, and there's also advantageous. I can be richer than you and others, and I can be poorer. And my willingness to redistribute in response to those different types of inequality may not be the same. Actually, for many individuals, it's not the same. They are only willing to redistribute in cases in which they are poorer. They want to take from the others, but then they don't want to give when they're richer. But there are also those who would generally try to equalize. So that's why we need to do this separately. And that also gives rise to this theoretical expectation, which is, well, if you are an A equalizer, if you tend to equalize, if you are richer, well, then you should be more willing to support welfare benefits, right? Because that's exactly what this is, like making the poor richer. And so I think this is probably consistent with your perspective on this.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand that.
It's always the presenter. Yes?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Adding some nuances to the distinction, because now you just have two groups, so you have the advantage and the disadvantage. I wonder whether those who are, because there seems to be a scale, for instance, when it comes to being the advantage, right? Those who are at the top of the scale, perhaps they would be more willing to cut low rate money, whereas those who are distributed over the medium, they would be not that much. I don't know. So I was just wondering whether you would find additional more interesting results if you nuance for the distinction that you have there.
The distinction between?
Because you just have
Between what? The distinction between what? What's it?
So because you have two groups, right? You have the disadvantage and the advantage, right?
Yeah, we have three. Like we have disadvantageous inequality, equality, and advantage.
Yeah. So those are in the advantages or the advantage group.
Mm-hmm.
Because in real life, you can have an income, a monthly income that is higher than average. But if you just have a bit, in my opinion, perhaps you would have an opinion or a behavior that would be different than those who are at the top of the advantage. Like if you have just, I don't know, like $2,000 dollars monthly income higher than the median, you have a certain type of behavior or opinion. Whereas if you have, I don't know, if you're a billionaire, perhaps you have a different sort of policy or of behavior.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering whether adding that nuance to the distinction would, but it would just be additional knowledge, right? It would have, I'm very much convinced by your results. I think it's a great study. I was just
Yeah, I totally share this interest in effect heterogeneity. I think this reminds me a little bit of one of the questions that we had about like whether the causal that's not problem. The causal effects, whether the causal effects differ across income groups, like household income, for example. You're talking about those results, right? And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of trying to, in theoretically meaningful, interesting, and motivated ways, exploring effect heterogeneity. So far, the results suggest that there's no strong interaction between your own income and your willingness to redistribute. Specifically, like just to be clear, because this is a randomized experiment, those groups are in expectations interchangeable. So those are still valid comparisons, and so this is still a causally identified effect. But your point about like maybe there's sensitivity, like differences in the sensitivity to different types of inequality aversion as a function of theoretically interesting moderators, such as education, and then we would think about, well, what exactly is it that education should make you more sensitive to, say, favorable inequality? And there are various potential explanations in literature that we would need to develop in more detail. And so I totally I've shared that interest. I also, at this point, there's not much I can say besides that the income interaction isn't that strong. That's not going to explain a lot of the sensitivity and the sensitivity to different types of inequality. Yes.
So you said that your experiment is pretty clear. You just try to be as clear as possible with your respondents. But I was thinking about framing, and another way in which you could, frame the experiment is not talk about absolute values, but just talk about percentages, because this is something you see in the public discourse. So I was wondering whether you expect different kind of results where maybe you give 10%, you can give 15%, 20%, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, my question then would be 20% of what?
Of your, probably at that point you would have to have a total sum, which would be redistributed, or percentage of your, your amount of the other side's amount, something like that. Obviously, this would make things more complicated than what you have here.
Well, in some sense, this would just be like a small additional intellectual or computational challenge. If I tell you there's $100, and currently you're getting 20% of that. So you compute probably this is $20. And so I wonder whether that step is really crucial to get at the causal effect of inequality. It seems to add some kind of a small computational exercise that you have to engage in. And then so I do think that when you think about this in terms of framing, right, then things certainly get interesting, but also beyond what you've done here at this point. But the first thing that comes to mind, I think, is what happens if we are thinking about actual policy instruments and the fact that they are being endorsed, for example, by different parties. And suddenly, if you are identifying with the Republicans and the Republicans are endorsing a specific policy intervention, a tax cut for the rich, for example, then maybe you're just more willing to to support this idea because it has been endorsed by your party. So those things could be going on for sure, but at this point, I would love to see a follow-up study that combines some of the elements that we have, presented and developed here with those kinds of framing and communication elements.
I guess another question I had in mind was just how much of your own income are you able to give, or how much of the other's income you are willing to take, or something like that. And I think that would be closer to what you see in a public debate.
So, what share of the income?
Yeah.
So I would tell you, I make $1,000 per month, and so you can take, or probably also give. Yeah, I think so. One problem that I would have with this is that now you're really in the world of purely hypothetical redistribution, and one of the advantages of, I think, this stylized game give or take setting is that there's real inequality that we create. That is real inequality. It's not hypothetical. Because honestly, I don't think our IRB would be willing to approve of a study in which we actually redistribute income. So taking $500 from Leo and transferring it into my bank account. I may be fine with that, but my IRB would probably not, for good reasons. And so if we are not allowed to do that, then we're in a world of hypothetical setting, which I think that's one of the things that we wanted to avoid, at least at some point. Not everything here is behavioral, right? But we create real inequality and we observe real redistribution. It's not hypothetical redistribution. It's not how what would you take if you could, if my IRB would say yes to this. So that's, I think, the strength of this study. Yeah.
But just as an add-on, I mean, have you tested whether it also works as a hypothetical? So first of all, you would save money, and secondly, I mean, would the behavior be the same? Is the question. I mean, so have you tried that or not?
Yeah. That's a painful question because we actually work on a related study where one of the key challenges is to make this affordable.
Right.
Because if the incentives, they're really strong monetary incentives, at some point, we just don't have large enough research accounts. So that's a very important question. Part of my answer would rely on this experiment that we did in which we varied the stakes. So one very costly version of this would be everybody gets a gift card, and that's being paid out. And you could also multiply the value of the gift cards by a factor of 4. That will be way more expensive, especially with 5,000 respondents. And what this suggests is that even if you strongly reduce the incentive, the monetary stakes, the results are still informative about the type of redistribution behavior that you would that you would expect under different inequality scenarios. Now, there's the next step would be, what happens if you make this purely hypothetical? There's nothing that you can, not even in expectations. So we haven't explored that. Part of me says it would be nice if that was the case because it would be the most affordable of all. Part of me is well, then the things that we think matter when we assess research design and survey results, specifically the things that make some results maybe stronger, is the behavioral component, and that means there have to be costs to do something. As opposed to purely stated, there have to be costs to a specific action. So if we take away all those costs and it's purely hypothetical, part of me is yeah, that would be nice, and we actually have worked on some of this when trying to measure risk and time preferences, where we are trying to test strongly incentivized mechanisms versus less incentivized, including hypothetical, and those results suggest that the hypothetical would work at this point, I can't tell you whether this would generate the same results if you turn this into purely hypothetical setting. That would be something that I'd be happy to learn. If somebody would like to do this, that would be great. Yeah.
Do you think you will have different results if instead of have run this experiment in the US and in Germany, you have done it in one of the Mediterranean countries? Because it's true that both countries have different policies, redistribution policies, but at the same time, I think both, culturally speaking, are very influenced by Protestantism. So I'm wondering if, instead of that, you have to one of the Mediterranean countries, if the result will be,
So what would be your expectations? What would you expect in terms of how do you think should the causal effects vary? How would they differ if we did this in one of the countries that you're suggesting we should do this?
right? I think the redistribution will be lower.
And why is that the case?
Well, based on what we are observing, at least nowadays, in those countries, this is.
So, if I understand correctly, the logic is, well, in some countries we see less actual redistribution, lower levels of actual redistribution, and if the argument here is right, then we should also observe, if we say feel that study, we should find that, for example, the share of respondents willing to equalize in response to those different types of inequality should be lower. It's like this. It's a little bit like the logic that we use to assess the to some extent the plausibility of those results when comparing the United States and Germany with respect to their actual redistribution. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be a plausible kind of theoretical expectation. I'm not 100% sure whether that would solve the fact that at the country level there are only so many countries. So the country at that level, you live in a world in which if you wanted to compute the standard error, that would be pretty shocking, like shockingly large with an N of 4, 10, 15. But I like to think about those comparative cases. And so yeah, I'm totally open to doing something like this in those countries. There was one more question? Yeah, sure.
Is there a gender gap?
The gender gap?
In responses?
I should be able to say something about that. Yeah.
Another question.
So we have we looked at that? I don't think so. I don't think that we have looked at the heterogeneity and the treatment effects across gender. But I'd be interested in hearing your theoretical expectations. Why would you expect there to be differences in what direction? Excuse me? Who's generous?
Women.
All right. So I have one piece of evidence on that if you allow. So we also have a related project that did explore the causal effect of expectations about cooperative behavior on your willingness to contribute to public good in also representative samples. And so we had respondents play a little public goods game where you had an endowment and you could contribute something like a standard prisoner's dilemma kind of scenario. And we did look at the social demographic predictors of the contribution. How much of your, say, $100, 100 euros, we did this in 4 countries, are you contributing to the public good, right? And the results that we have there, and they are published, suggest that on average, if you have like $100 endowment, women actually tend to contribute $2 less on average than men. I'm sorry. Like, we also checked twice that this is not a coding error.
So I would like your reaction to another kind of experiment along the same line. Where they would be to see in the lab, many people, 10 are endowed only $25 and 10 endowed $75. They have to make a decision about whether there will be a distribution or not. The majority has to decide. What do you think of that setup?
So I think it adds an important element, which is the institutions that we use to transform individual preferences into a collective choice. The way you describe this, I think I would like to add a little more detail in order to say something useful about this. But so one of the requirements could be like majority, right? There needs to be a majority in favor of redistribution. At this point, I'm not sure. Well, we can spin this in many different ways, but like one certainly would be, what are the majority requirements? And so depending on the majority requirements, the distribution of what we call A and D types, right? Specifically the joint distribution, would be an important piece of information to understand whether there is a majority or not. That's, I think, the argument that is implicit when we highlight that, oh, there seems to be a divide in those two societies as to whether an individual is willing to do both, like equalize in response to disadvantageous inequality and also equalize in response to advantageous inequality. So, and then of course, whether this happens is a function of the institutional rules and the decision-making procedures. And all of this is like assumed away. We bring this in a little bit because we still think it's all the more surprising that you find those cross-country differences to line up with the distributions of L, A, and D types in our surveys. But at the same time, it's an N, like as I said, like it's 2 countries. So I'm not making any like strong claims that are based on that. But the idea to bring in institutions and voting mechanisms, that I think is a pretty like fascinating approach.
In fact, my question is not about institutions, it's about whether we behave differently when we see the poor. The other group is there, we see the group on one end, and whether the decision is public rather than private. That's my impact.
Oh, okay. So, okay, whether the decision is whether you can see how somebody voted or not, I think that will be a feature of the institution, whether there's a secret ballot or not. But at the end of the day, it is really about like, do I know whether like Angus was against voting against redistribution or not, right? So that I think could be very informative. The second component is exposure to poverty. And we actually had this little workshop on causal inference and experimental design, and one of the grad students presented a paper on that question, like actual exposure to inequality and to what extent that affects your willingness to redistribute or support policies that redistribute. And I think that's like really an important question that we speak to some extent, because we live in the stylized world where in the give or take game, you are exposed to somebody who's obviously poorer, right? I know that it may not be as intense as you encountering somebody who's like terribly poor and like maybe starving, right? That may be a more shocking, certainly like a more shocking intervention. At the same time, I'm not sure whether that is the median voters' experience especially in industrialized countries, where at least in the United States, I see many ways in which those who have more isolate themselves from being exposed to those who have less. Gated communities are an example. So although I would be interested in those more extreme encounters, I'm not sure whether this is the most ecologically interesting case, valid case. Yeah. Was there one more question? Angus had one. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Just maybe I'm not reading the plot again, but I hope I am this time. For the causal portion, the average amount that is given or taken to sort of redistribute is approximately the same. Is that correct? I'm reading this correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that strikes me about this is, you have the slide up like the don't care people. Maybe they just don't care. What's striking about this is that people are remarkably unselfish and remarkably comfortable with the status quo to some extent. In that, they got 50, I got 50. All right, that's fine. This seems a bit unfair. I'll take a little bit, but really they've still almost got double what I have and vice versa. So 35 to 65 this sort of redistribution on average. So this to me seems to be a little bit, at least, a story about comfort with the status quo and sort of maybe not an apathy, but like well, it might be greed if I took more. It's okay the way it is. Maybe a little bit more, but not much. And so this story is not supplementary. It might be complementary to the one you're telling us, but just would like to hear your thoughts a little bit about that sort of status quo. Maybe the reason things don't change is people are like, this is the way it is. Maybe a little more would be nice, but it's okay.
So first of all, those are average effects. So at least theoretically, if say on average they would give 10, and the respondent would give 10 if he or she is richer. That could result from 50% giving a lot and 50% giving nothing. So I think the more informative way of looking at this is, well, individual level measures of inequality aversion, and I think that is part of the motivation for actually doing this at the individual level, because those are aggregate effects. So I can't tell you like what is what's really going on, how homogeneous are those effects actually. So this is exactly why we do this kind of exercise, and I think one of the striking results is that there is strong differences across individuals as to how willing are they to redistribute in response to two different types of inequality. So all this variation, the individual level variation in responses to two different types of inequality, makes this interesting in a compositional, from a compositional perspective, and that's why ultimately, you have to do some classification, but that's why we try to break this down at the individual level, where we can say something about like what really is the share of equalizers roughly. What is the share of those who tend to not equalize, and distinguishing between those two types of inequality. Not sure whether this is really getting at this the key question, but
yeah, I mean, it does in the sense that overall there's not apathy, but like not as much interest as we might expect, because there's varying mechanisms, there are varying opinions going on in the general population, which sort of not cancel out, but lead to sort of a general, not as strong an effect as we might expect.
Yeah. So and I think the variation is clearly visible if you plot the parameter estimates. At the same time, it's not the case that everybody takes all the time. That's not at all the case. Quite like to the contrary, like an estimate larger than 0 would suggest that on average you would tend to redistribute a little bit. You're redistributing a little bit. So what you're saying, I think I can see the things that you're saying. I can see them going on in those results. Like some are actually not really sensitive. The zeros are the ones that I'm not going to change it, even if I could in 0 costs. There are like a noticeable share of the population that is willing to equalize, But there are some that would like equalize a little too much, some would equalize less. And so that's totally consistent with like heterogeneity, but I think all the more, like what this tells me is that if you want to implement more compelling tests of those arguments that relate to, say, this idea of preferences being a function of costs and benefits of the policies, that the political options, that should be benchmarked against what individuals perceive to be a desirable distribution or a desirable redistributive intervention, depending on whether we're making the rich poorer or the poor richer. Yes?
Yeah, we often usually hear stories about like the ultra-rich lobbying, trying to, how should I say, like weaken the redistribution system, especially in the United States. Do we learn something about this from your experiment? Do we see some people who are higher at the eye, like getting advantage about your experiment and more actually taking away? Do these people, so I've figured some of them, and do we know, is there like some socio-demographic trends among this group of people?
Yeah, so, okay, I actually totally share that interest in finding those different patterns of like responding to inequality. Specifically, we thought about two extreme versions. One extreme version is the one that we already talked about. That is, you should, like, if you're really like 100% selfish, you take everything all the time. Irrespective of how rich or poor the other person is, doesn't matter. You always take everything. Although that's not very widespread, there are individuals that are willing to do this. The other extreme is the Mother Teresa, right, approach, which is irrespective of how poor or rich you are, you would give everything to the other. If you have 75 and I have 25, I'd give you my 25. And this is this behavior, at least like that tendency, is sometimes visible. It's not like very pronounced, but it is there. And I think it's a very interesting follow-up question to try to basically understand the distribution of those different types across socio-demographic groups. Like, where do you find the strongly selfish types? Where do you find the highly altruistic types? And we started to do this. Reviewers were not terribly excited, so we actually, it's not part of the published article, but we did look into this a little bit, and I think I have some results. I realize that there is something. Yeah. Yeah, so we did look at, so now we're back in the world where we only distinguish between those who equalize and those who not, and those who do something else. And those are the socio-demographic predictors of redistribution type, talking about advantageous inequality. So if you are exposed to favorable inequality, do you tend to equalize or not, or do you do something that is erratic, or you don't know what that is supposed to mean? And this is, the red dots are the equalizers. And so whenever the point estimates are positive, then you are more likely to find those equalizers in that group. And the most interesting correlation is probably with ideology. You are actually significantly less likely to find those types that redistribute and equalize in response to advantageous inequality, so they are richer, if they report to, be ideologically right. Then you're significantly less likely to find them. That's probably the strongest correlation when you're talking about equalizers, right? You also find that like non-equalizers are, almost equally widespread across age groups, and the remaining findings aren't like terribly striking. If you look at the social predictors of de-redistribution types, so this is what do you do if you are poorer than the other, you also find the strong correlation with ideology, and here you will find that those who are willing to take from the other, if the other is richer, are on average like less likely among the left and the right. And so here the benchmark, the reference group is the moderates. Right? So compared to the moderates, say somebody who's reporting a left ideology is significantly less likely to equalize as compared to a moderate. Those are some of those social demographic predictors that you may be interested in. Yeah.
Does your data say something about like business owners or something like that?
About what?
Like business owners, certain groups of society, certain jobs.
So we do have measures of occupational status, employment status, and so on. I think I'm not sure whether we have actually explicitly explored this.
Because the group in society that would be accused of this behavior would mostly be like, I don't know, the cock rotters, like fake business owners. I mean, those people won't be in your sample for sure, but like maybe you could proxy for that.
Oh, you never know.
Smaller, yeah. Maybe you could proxy for that with small business owners or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, my first attempt would be to argue that this is strongly correlated with income, and I think that's probably also the reason why people think they're maybe less likely to support redistribution, because they tend to be relatively wealthy, and so they think they will lose from redistribution, at least economically. What sort of is not very consistent with this argument is that the sensitivity to inequality is not strongly modeled, does not strongly depend on income, and maybe maybe that's true because we don't have those individuals who make more than like $1 million or $2 million or 10 million per year. That could be one reason. On the other hand, the evidence that we have for redistribution preferences among the super rich, at least my reading is not that they strongly oppose redistribution. That's not the case, and you can pinpoint, you can come up with pretty famous and well-known examples of super rich individuals who are extremely redistributed.
All right, that's all the time for questions we have now, but the conversation will continue afterward. But in the meantime, an early holiday gift.